Hi, this is Natalie Hoffman of FlyingFreeNow.com, and you're listening to the Flying Free Podcast, a support resource for women of faith looking for hope and healing from hidden emotional and spiritual abuse. Welcome to episode 287 of the Flying Free Podcast. Today, I'm going to read you 3 chapters from part 3 of my newest book, All the Scary Little Gods. This is going to be chapter 58, chapter 63, and chapter 65. Now, all 3 of these chapters are about my experiences dealing with Christian counselors or Bible counselors, as well as the elders from the church that eventually excommunicated me. So they all have that theme to them, and I thought about actually just putting the audible recordings right here on the podcast, but then I decided I'm actually just going to read to you as if you and I were sitting in a living room and I was just reading to you from my book. So you might hear my pages turn and you might hear the rain outside. It's raining right now. I'm not sure if you can hear that or not. You might hear one of my kids interrupt me. We're just going to get real here and I'm just going to read to you, okay? All right, here's chapter 58. This chapter is called Bible Counseling. In May of 2014, I wrote in my journal, I have been a child my whole life, and I need to grow up. I'm afraid to walk away from people who drag me back to being a child because they are the God figures in my life. If I rebel against them, I am rebelling against God himself, and then he won't be with me. See the twisted thinking? Wanting God has kept me playing this child role, but that isn't what God requires or wants, is it? What if I can have all of God and none of the controlling people in my life who would hold me down and wipe me out so they can feel better about their own brokenness? If only. I've been fighting and clawing to be an adult. It's time to stop. I don't need anyone's approval. God is calling me to freedom and adulthood. Okay, that's what I wrote in my journal. I was starting to get it, but I still had a couple more years of banging for help on human doors just to make double, triple, quadruple sure God wasn't there. That summer, I heard about a female member of our church, Carla, who was getting her nouthetic counseling certificate and looking for people to help. I decided to see if she could help me. Nouthetic counselors are trained in a method of counseling that teaches all of the answers to life's problems can be found in the Bible alone. So Carla informed me right up front that she would not be able to offer me her wisdom or support if I was thinking of a divorce. The Bible was clear that divorce was sin and God hated it. At that point, I should have run, but instead I assured her that divorce was off the table and I only wanted help dealing with my own sinful reactions to the things my husband was doing and saying. I knew she would like that answer, and she did. I was accepted. After a couple of sessions, it became apparent she didn't believe I was being abused. She told me that abuse was a, quote, strong word to use, unquote, implying that it was too strong in my case. She said she had a great deal of experience with, quote, real abuse, unquote, that involved physical injuries, implying that my experiences were petty by comparison. I had emailed some things to my husband, and in an effort to be transparent, I copied both Carla and Pastor Don, who was helping John, so they could monitor our conversation and offer their feedback. These emails between John and me disclosed ongoing behaviors that hurt me, and although I tried to be objective, I let some of my deep frustration of over 2 decades peek through. Carla told me in our next meeting that I was rude to my husband in one of the email exchanges, and it shocked her. What? She didn't like my rude? I asked her what specifically was so shocking, and she gave me an example where I had been sarcastic. Tail between my legs, my melancholy part woefully admitted that I should have left that one sarcastic comment out of my email to John. Bad girl. Interestingly enough, she did not express the slightest shock over the 22 years of criticism, silent treatment, and dehumanizing behavior my husband had put me through, and was continuing to put me through right before her very eyes. She could see that John still wasn't responding to me or my efforts to communicate on a basic level, and he wasn't making any efforts to get his family back. Because it didn't seem to bother her, I began to wonder if perhaps this kind of behavior was expected of males in Christian homes. Maybe I really was the crazy one who never got the memo. In one session, she told me, "You've gone on and on about this stuff already. Can we move on to something else?" Stunned, I made a mental note to be careful about what I said to her, or she'd get annoyed and scold me like a child. If she got irritated just talking about John's repetitive behaviors with me, how did she think it felt to live with them for over 2 decades? Carla gave me several homework assignments that involved looking up Bible verses and explaining what they meant and how they related to being a good Christian wife. I was pretty sure I had read 4 or 5 times the number of books and Bible studies on that subject than she had, but I dutifully completed all the assignments and turned them in on time. I felt like a child in grade school again, hoping my teacher would like me if I did everything she said. One of the assignments she gave me was to reach out to 3 people who knew me well and ask them what they liked and didn't like about how I related to them. I suspected she was fishing for evidence that I was a problem child, but I cooperatively asked Marcy, my adult son, and a friend from church. Their replies were short and sweet. They said I was honest, funny, reliable, willing to admit my mistakes, a good listener, easy to talk to, and empathetic. Regarding what they did not like about me, my sister lightheartedly said she didn't always like my advice, but I was her big sister, so she expected advice now and again. My adult son said he thought the assignment was dumb. And my church friend said I was too decisive and used too many words when trying to explain things. Good to know. My kids would probably agree. Carla also told me to ask John these same questions. John was a classic stonewaller and generally responded to less than 10% of anything I wrote to him, so I wasn't sure he would respond. But lo and behold, this time he responded in lightning flash fashion with a lengthy email detailing the myriad ways I failed to relate well. He prefaced his answer by writing that he hoped and prayed God would communicate the truth through him, quote, in grace, unquote. God bless his soul. I will spare the reader all the negative details John believed God wanted him to communicate to the Bible counselor, but here are a few. I wasn't able to see my sin. I wasn't able to forgive my husband. I didn't trust God. I expected too much of my husband. I was disrespectful, rude, and demanding. I was also negative, controlling, and selfishly wanted attention. I always accused him of things he never did. I made assumptions about him and unfairly judged him. Then he said he was afraid of me, and others were afraid of me as well. First, he said, was my mom. What? She would have scoffed if she knew. She wasn't afraid of anything or anyone, let alone dumb old me. The next one on his list was my youngest sister, Alice. I think he was confused. I was terrified of her, not the other way around. She, like Mom, was unflappable and had no problem giving me the stink eye if I so much as looked at her the wrong way. Yes, I was scared of her stink eye. The third person on his list was his favorite elder and personal fan, George. My best guess was that George thought I was fierce because I had a vagina, and yet words still came out of my mouth. Fourth was Pastor Luke, who had groomed me in my early 20s. His fear made sense. I had some things on him. I would later join a group of women to testify against him in an investigation that would force him to retire from that church, so I could see how I might be scary to Pastor Luke. And finally, John named a woman from church who believed I should homeschool, wear skirts, and not allow my daughters to go to college, and I was rebelling in all those areas. I could maybe see how she might be scared of me. To her, I was a rebel, and maybe rebels are scary. But honestly, I was intimidated by her. She seemed so perfect by our church's standards, and I was now considered an unsubmissive wife, the worst possible label for any woman to wear. Looking back on this years later, I'm aware that any licensed therapist worth their salt would see this move on John's part as classic DARVO, DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. But we weren't dealing with a licensed therapist. We were dealing with a woman who was getting a certificate in nouthetic Bible counseling. And she didn't see a damn thing. When these assignments were completed and turned in, I noticed she wouldn't comment on them. That's how I knew they were useless busy work. As her compassion for my abuser became more apparent, a familiar panic flooded me with shame and an irrational longing to disappear into the ground. I had come to her for help only to get another noose around my neck. I sent her a respectful breakup email after a few months of going in circles. During my time with her, Carla recommended another Bible counselor for both John and me to see together as a couple. John didn't want to do more marriage counseling, but George and Pastor Don were pressuring him to do whatever he needed to do to save the marriage, so he agreed to go if I did the work of setting up the appointment. Since I was still feeling responsible to pull the weight in our relationship, I set up the appointment and we drove separately to meet with the new counselor. Why did I keep making the effort and trying to find a solution? I wasn't a glutton for punishment. I just wasn't giving Rude the credibility she deserved yet. Rosie and Miss Judgy Pants were still running the show, but even they were running out of steam. However, on this particular day, I brought Rude along in my back pocket, and I let her do what she wanted to do. Right at the very beginning of the session, the Bible counselor invited John and me to share how our sin had contributed to our marriage problems. Ah, yes, I was familiar with this approach. My entire life was one anxious concern about how my sin was contributing to the entire world's demise. My melancholy and spiritualizer parts were wired to scour my inner world, locate my sin, and blame everything that was happening in my life on myself and my failures. Melancholy kept insisting that I deserved to suffer and die. But Rude kept raising her snarky head from my back pocket to audaciously declare, "No, I don't want to suffer and die. I want to live." In the past, Rosie, Melancholy, and Spiritualizer would sit in the Bible counselor's office or the pastor's office or the elder's office, and they would cooperate. They would dutifully answer the questions, always ready to throw me under the bus. Sometimes Melancholy would offer exaggerated confessions of sin, Anne of Green Gables style. If only this new person would help me and provide some relief. But not this time. This time, I put Rude in charge, and she sat stubbornly staring at the carpet, refusing to speak up. She would be as silent as John always was. This time, I would let John be the first one to confess. I wanted to see what would happen if I changed the pattern for once. After a long silence, the Bible counselor asked, "So, who would like to go first?" More silence. He looked at me questioningly, as if John's silence was normal man stuff, but my silence indicated rebellious stubbornness the counselor was determined to root out. Feeling uncomfortable by the counselor's silent stares, I caved a little and admitted, I usually answer questions like this first. I've easily wallowed in my sin my entire life. I can confess to pages and pages of sin. I am so familiar with it. I'm constantly saying I'm sorry and begging for forgiveness and expecting very little in return. I made this appointment because my ability to confess my sin is not the issue in our marriage. His inability to confess his is the issue. So let's start there. And I turned to look expectantly at John. Lest you think that I felt confident and in control, let me clarify that I did not. I was shaking like a leaf inside. My body was nauseated and dizzy. At one point, the room swayed and darkened, and I thought I was going to black out. I put my head down and sucked in air. The Bible counselor asked me if I was okay, and I sheepishly told him I felt a little sick. I could hear the critical voices of John and Mom in my head saying, "What a grandstander, always being dramatic and making a big deal out of nothing. There's no such thing as a panic attack. People are just making that up to get attention." I wondered if the counselor was thinking that too. I took some deep breaths and my vision normalized, but my heart was still pounding. John confessed to a couple of vague sins like, "I don't always listen very well," and "sometimes I can get upset when she is hounding me about things." The Bible counselor seemed satisfied. John had confessed. Good boy. Then came my turn, but I wasn't biting. Rude pushed Freaked to the side and said, "Don't you see how general those confessions are? And half of them are about how he is a victim of his wife. He's turning this all around. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going to pour out confessions of how terrible I am. I am looking for help. My husband chronically mistreats me, and nobody will help me." My voice was desperate and forceful. I leaned forward and begged, "I just need someone to see what is going on here. I need someone to believe me. I need you to stop looking at me and all the reasons why I deserve to be treated like this, and I need you to address his issues." The counselor leaned forward too, and his eyes narrowed on mine. "Do you want to know how I feel right now?" And he waited for an answer. Taken aback, I meekly said, "Okay." His eyes stared me down as he said, "I feel like running 1,000,000 miles per hour in the opposite direction. You are like a buzzsaw, Natalie. I can see why your husband doesn't want to be here and why he is running in the opposite direction from you as well. Do you want to talk about this?" But I had no control over my mouth, my body, or my brain at that point. My insides were utter chaos. White noise. There was a massive food fight on my bus of parts. Loud sobs spontaneously ripped out of my gut, and it was everything I could do to get my arms to cooperate and pick up my purse so I could stand up on my jelly legs and wobble to the door to leave. I drove our van home in the pouring rain, and all I remember is scanning the sides of the freeway for a good place to drive the van off, a place that would guarantee I wouldn't survive. Little Natalie was howling in agony, begging me to be done. She could not do it anymore. Please, dear God, let the pain end. I don't know how I got home. I found out later that John was telling people, "Natalie quit on 2 counselors in 1 year." At that point, I decided to give it a year, pray for a miracle, and then file for divorce if nothing changed. I stopped going to our church and began visiting a different church. I also found a new pastoral counselor who seemed to understand my situation better. I say seemed to because eventually I'd have to quit on that one too. That's the end of that chapter. I don't think I talk about that situation with that particular counselor. She was not a licensed therapist. She was just another Bible counselor. And she was a good listener, and she actually believed me at first. But then I made a huge mistake, and I gave her permission to meet with my husband. And also, she began to have conversations with some of the elders from church. And between her talks with them and her talks with my husband, she eventually decided that maybe I was the problem. And then after she worked with my husband for a little while longer, she decided that maybe I wasn't the problem. The fact is that she just didn't know. She was not trauma informed. She didn't understand emotional abuse very well. And she was just kind of being taken for a ride by everybody. But by the time she figured it out and apologized to me, it was too late. The damage had already been done, and my reputation was completely squashed at that point. But anyway, I didn't write about all of that because my book mainly focuses on the spiritual aspect of, my spiritual journey. So there's a lot of things that I did not write in my book. In fact, the book right now is 2/3 of what it actually was when I originally wrote it. So anyhow, I'm going to read you another chapter. This one is a lot shorter. It's chapter 63, and it's called George. And George was one of the elders that was working with me. And I mentioned him in that other chapter. And by the way, if there's a lot of things in the other chapter I realize that you might have missed if you've not read my book. But you know what? If you want to fill in the blanks, you'll have to read my book. So here's chapter 63, George. By the way, all these names were changed to protect the not innocent. Okay. I had stopped attending church prior to meeting with Pastor Justin and his team, but now I tentatively returned even though I felt uncomfortable knowing people were talking negatively about me. I still believed that going to church was part of having a healthy relationship with God. The church was the body of Christ, and I wanted to be part of that. Justin and his team were calling themselves DART, Domestic Abuse Response Team. And one of the first things they did was address how George had handled my case and my friend's case. George was the elder put in charge of doing marriage counseling for both couples, and after realizing that George had been duped by John's grooming, I put an end to meeting with him when I asked John to move out. However, a few months later, George reached out to me with an invitation to get more marriage counseling from him. And by the way, this is not a marriage counselor, this is just a married man who I would not want the kind of marriage that he had with his wife either, but because he was appointed as a volunteer elder, he was able to give marriage counseling help to couples who were struggling, including abusive marriages, which is just completely inappropriate. But anyway, back to the story. I told him I didn't see any evidence that John was interested in relating to me in healthy, responsible ways, and until I could see that, I would decline any further marriage counseling. George disagreed, gave me his reasons why, and then asked if I would reconsider. Again, I declined. But George persisted by sending a lengthy email accusing me of judging John, not trusting John, airing John's faults, and killing John's spirit. He said that even if John was hurting me and the children, I had no right to assume what his intentions or motives were, and that I needed to be a better communicator. Then he told me I was not a gentle woman. I was disrespectful, and I was discouraging to John. He talked about how critical women like me devastate their husbands. You guys, these are the actual words he used in his email to me. Okay, I'm not making this up. A lot of the stuff that's in my book, it's not out of my memory. It is from letters that people sent to me and words that people actually said. It's from me coming home and immediately writing down things as I, like within a few hours of them happening. So anyway, he threw in several Bible verses. He said he was sad to hear that I could have a life without John and that John loved me even if I was unable to believe that. And again, he was someone with no understanding. Like he was not having sex with us. He didn't live with us. He wasn't in our home watching us. All he saw and knew about our family was things that John told him. And that's what he's just going to go with that. So I just think that's so funny that talk about making assumptions. That's another thing he was constantly saying. You're always making assumptions. I'm like, what do you think you're doing when you're jumping to all of these conclusions that are completely not even true? Okay. He added several flowery Christian cliches like, and I'm quoting his emails, God grants us new mercies every day and pours out an abundance of grace on us so that we can do his will. And God knew that we could not stand if he sent his Son into the world to condemn the world. That is why he sent Jesus in order that we may be saved. And my prayer for you is that you would be able to extend God's grace to each other, share the steadfast love of the Lord with each other, help each other grow in the likeness of his precious Son, Jesus Christ, to walk humbly with the Lord, and finally, but primarily, fear the Lord and delight in his ways. It's almost like he wanted to be like this. This is me again talking, not the book. It's almost like he wanted to be like the next Apostle Paul or something. It's kind of funny. There were many things I found wrong about his email, not the least of which was how a person could shred another person to pieces while simultaneously quoting scripture. I decided to respond with an email carefully addressing the items he brought up one by one. And I concluded with this. I don't think it is unreasonable for me to ask that John show a change of heart in some small ways, consistently, before we enter back into mutual counseling. I think he needs to figure out why he gives up so easily if he truly wants to love me or have a better marriage or be a better dad. When he can show me that it is not just talk, but walk, then I would be willing to work on rebuilding our relationship. What I'm not willing to do is push, prod, or plead anymore. He has to want to, and then actually start to do it. A good starting place would be for him to go back to the emails I've sent over the past 2 months and answer them. George could not take no for an answer. He sent yet another letter saying he did not want to email back and forth because, quote, it is not a good way to communicate, unquote. And then he proceeded to extensively argue every single one of my points, badgering me further about how terribly I was treating poor John. He closed by asking me to read the scriptures he sent, meditate on them, and get back to him with my thoughts about them. I sent one last email attempting to explain where I was coming from. George, I don't feel like you've heard anything I've tried to say for the past 6 months. I am trying to put the pieces of my life back together after my final failed attempts to connect with John. And all I'm hearing is how broken and paralyzed John is, and how it is somehow my responsibility to put him back together again. Do you honestly think that is what God is requiring? Or is this what you are requiring? I'm also feeling that you somehow think it's a negative thing for me to move forward. I know that I don't have to buckle under those kinds of messages because God says differently. Nevertheless, they feel hurtful, as if you want John's happiness, but not mine or the children's. Restoration and work come after repentance, not before. And please do not tell me that his heart is repentant and that I am misunderstanding or misjudging him. The evidence is not there. And several of us who actually live with him have tried to tell you, but you've refused to listen. Incredibly, John wrote back again, this time requesting to talk to me on the phone. I briefly answered by letting him know I was tired of going around in circles with him, and I asked him to please leave me alone. I never heard from him again. I finally learned that when our no is ignored or disrespected, we can stop being polite and just shut the door in someone's face. And by the way, I didn't write a lot about this in my book, again, because just for, the sake of brevity, but I had been dealing with this man for years. This is not some of these things that I share with you the end result of it, where I'm, showing up in a stronger way and having thought through a lot of things. That is after years of cooperating with these people, of groveling, of, submitting to them, of doing all the things that they tell me to do, going through all these hoops for them. And I finally was just I was just so exhausted. And plus I was also getting coaching by that time. And began to show up a little bit stronger. But this is exactly what I walk women through in my program, Flying Free. I help them to be able to get to that place where they can actually stand up for themselves and they can stop being hooked into all of these other people that are trying to control their lives. All right, I'm going to read you one more chapter. This is chapter 65. It's called Hoops and Masks. In May of 2015, John had 3 months to show the DART team that he could change. The team would meet with him once a month to discuss his homework and his progress, and after 3 months, they would reassess the situation and decide how to proceed from there. They told him to get psychiatric help. He got Bible counseling instead. And he was assigned an accountability partner, another father of a large family in our church who didn't know me and didn't know about our situation. This man never once reached out to meet me, but from this time on, he regularly met with and supported John. By the way, this man and his family supported John for years afterwards, and they've never ever reached out to find out how I'm doing or anything about me or my life or the other kids. I just find that to be so fascinating. John was also given a checklist of things to do to show he was changing, but it was just a series of hoops that John would be able to successfully jump through with a little effort and a lot of smoke and mirrors. John was back to figuring out which mask would work best with this new group of people, and I was back on the treadmill going nowhere. With this new pressure on him, John was suddenly answering every single one of my emails in a timely manner. Some of the emails I sent to John were simple updates just to keep him informed of what was going on with the kids, and they didn't require an answer. But now he was uncharacteristically and unnecessarily responding to all of them. His responses were robotic and insincere, but the fact that he was responding proved to me that he was capable of doing this in spite of 2 decades of non-responsiveness, as long as he had someone holding his hand and saying, "Jump," with a treat at the other end. The team didn't give me any direction at this point other than to tell me to sit back and wait. I asked them to give me updates in writing, and they responded by telling me about their more recent meeting and the homework they gave John to complete. They wanted to identify the things John did that, quote, drove Natalie crazy, unquote. I thought their choice of words was odd. Things that drove me crazy? Did they see me as a petty, easily annoyed wife who kept complaining about socks on the floor or squashed toothpaste tubes? I could feel my hope crumbling at the edges. John was being nice and helpful per their instructions, but it was just the same old abuse cycle. If the past was any indicator of the present, he was only being nice to get himself off the hook. I was angry for being put in the same position of having to help him and make things easy on him, or else looking like an ungrateful, unforgiving, bitter wife. The women on the DART team recommended that I sit back and let the elders work with John on their own. They wanted me to leave the past behind and focus only on what was going on in the present. They wanted me to get out of the way, stop interacting with John, and avoid triggering John to be abusive. They wanted to see if John was abusive without me being involved. They didn't get it. They didn't understand how abuse worked. Toddlers are amazing little creatures when they are at the fair with cotton candy in their sticky fists, and abusers do well when they are not being provoked by everyday life with a human wife and a bunch of human kids. The DART team wanted to see if John could be a good man without any provocations to determine if he was abusive. And that made no sense to me. I just want to cut in here and say this too. During this time that John's trying to prove that he's not abusive, John is living alone in an apartment and he's seeing the kids for basically 24 to 36 hours on the weekend. And not all the kids, just a few of them. I still have the littlest kids with me because they were really, really young then. So he has no stressors in his life. Meanwhile, I'm at home with I have 9 kids, but 8 of them were living with me at the time. 8 children, and 1 was 3 years old at the time that this actual thing was happening. And he had autism, had just been diagnosed with autism. So I was dealing with loads of paperwork and trying to get him into services and all this kind of stuff. That's what was going on in my life. I was undergoing all of that pressure. I was running a business. I was managing everything at home and all of the kids. And John was doing nothing, going to work, coming home, watching TV or playing computer games or whatever he did. And that was it. And they wanted to see, can he hold his shit together just for 3 months while he's not living with his family and all on his own? It's like, what are you talking about? Anybody could do that. But that's what they thought would be the proof that he was actually not abusive at all. So back to the story. I wrote to the women, I understand that you're trying to help some of the other elders see John's sin. The idea is that as long as I'm not triggering John to be abusive and manipulative, then they will be able to see that John does it all by himself. Just have to cut in here again. An abuser abusing all by himself? Does that even make any sense? It's so insane. Okay, back to the story. His sin is his responsibility, and they won't be able to pin John's sin on me. But that is not helping them understand abuse at all. That's perpetuating a lie about abuse. The lie is this: abuse is the woman's fault. If John's abuse could be miraculously turned into visible bruises and cuts on the outside, would you ask me to avoid triggering my husband as much as possible so that if he hit me, the others could see that it wasn't really my fault? Would you say, Natalie, when you talk to John, pretend he's never hit you. Let him off the hook as much as possible so he isn't triggered by your fear and anger and emotion. That way, when he hits you, the others can see that you didn't do anything to make him do it. We want them to see you were a good girl with no emotion and no expectations, so they know John just did it because he wanted to be mean. Then we can discipline him for that. This tells me I need to be a perfect little robot wife to avoid getting swung at. You can tell me everything I'm doing wrong and how I can change, and I will work my butt off to change and cooperate. But don't tell John. This is John's biggest loophole, his biggest excuse. As long as this is a marriage issue and not an abuse issue, John will continue to lay all responsibility at my feet. Of course, on the outside, he will say all the things you want to hear him say. He wants you off his back. But once you are all gone, he will turn to me and stab me in the back with the weapon that you gave him. So don't give it to him, okay? Because while nobody can see the gaping wound in my back, I can feel it, and it hurts like hell. They did not address my concerns, but instead reiterated my need to get out of the way. At the end of June, I was still not optimistic about how well John was clearing all the hoops, and I continued making hopeless attempts to show them the more nuanced issues going on. They finally straight out asked me what it would take for me to say, yes, John has changed. And that's when I realized John had found the mask that worked best with this group. The only problem was that John's mask didn't work for me, which then made me the problem. And that is the end of that chapter. If you liked those chapters and you want to read the entire book, you can. It's being sold on Amazon.com right now. You can go straight to Amazon and just put in the search bar All the Scary Little Gods by Natalie Hoffman and find it there. It comes in paperback, Audible, where I actually read the entire book on Audible, or Kindle versions. Or you can just use we're going to put direct links in the show notes. You can just go through the direct link if you want to. And then also, of course, I've walked this journey and I have done a lot of healing. Obviously, we'll probably be doing healing for the rest of my life, but this is something that I'm passionate about. and that I can relate to Christian women about who have gone through this, all of this crazy making. And I've worked with several thousands of women now in the last 7 years in the Flying Free program. And I would love to work with you. If you want to work with me, it's $29 a month. That's it. And you get access to me in a private forum, as well as 4 other coaches who have all been through the same or similar things, and as well as hundreds of other Christian women who are going through what you're going through. So $29 a month or $290 for an entire year of support. It's not just a forum. There's courses. There's weekly live coaching. There are Q&As. We've got expert workshops and butterfly stories and the whole 9 yards. It is a program that is jam-packed with help for you. And if you join and do the work, 1 year from now, you will not be the same person. So if you wish that you had some different kinds of skills and a different way of looking at your situation, I highly encourage you to join. If you're afraid about using your credit card or your husband seeing the charge and wondering what you're all about or what you're doing, you could get a friend to use their credit card. You need to get their permission, obviously. Or you could have your friend purchase a gift code for you for $290. Basically, they become like a sponsor for you. And then they will receive a code that they give to you. And then when you go register, you put the code in and then you get your year for free. You can do it that way too. If you want more information about that, we have to kind of help you set that up on the back end. So send us an email, communitysupport@flyingfreenow.com. And I guess I should tell you where to go if you want to apply to be in the program. You need to go to joinflyingfree.com if you want to complete an application to join. We do require all members to have completed an application that we can vet before we send you an invitation to join. That's it. We'll see you next week. Hey, beautiful butterfly. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, be sure to subscribe and then consider leaving a rating and review so others can find us. To connect with me and get a free chapter of my book, head over to flyingfreenow.com. And until next time, fly free.